You know that feeling when you look at something really complex, maybe a big project or a movement, and you just wonder, how did that even get started?
Yeah, or how something small manages to grow, especially when it crosses into different cultures or, totally new environments.
Exactly. It feels like there's this mix of like a huge vision, but also these tiny practical steps happening on the ground.
It absolutely does.
Mm.
And whether we're talking about, say, a new nonprofit tackling a tough social issue, or maybe a startup finding its feet, or, well, what we're exploring today, starting new faith communities,
Uh-huh.
those dynamics of starting, adapting, growing across different contexts, they're incredibly complex.
That's exactly it. So today, we're taking a deep dive into this world of church planting. And this isn't just theory, right? It's based on a whole collection of materials shared with us.
Right. Packed with research. Yeah, but also practical experience, real insights from people who've actually, done this work in some pretty challenging, diverse places around the globe.
And our goal here, our mission in this deep dive, is really to cut through some of that complexity and pull out the most important insights for you.
Yeah, we want to unpack the foundations, the sort of why behind it, look at the different shapes these things can take, understand the practical steps involved from start to finish.
And touch on things like teams, training, support, all that crucial stuff.
Exactly. All drawn from these sources.
Okay, sounds great. Let's jump right in there. Let's unpack those foundations. When these sources talk about church planting, what are they really getting at? What's the core idea?
Well, the core idea they put forward is this really powerful blend. It's about combining timeless biblical principles, looking at the New Testament church, as the model for what a local church should be.
Okay.
But blending that with the best practices learned from all kinds of experiences around the world, they really stress that the biblical principles, they're fixed. They don't change,
Right.
but the world changes constantly. So the specific methods, the way we apply those principles, well, they have to adapt.
Okay, so it's definitely not about finding some kind of magic blueprint then, like one size fits all.
Absolutely not, no. The material explicitly pushes back on that. It doesn't say you must use house churches or you have to follow this exact evangelism method. Instead, it looks at a really wide range of efforts, different contexts, the cities, villages, cultures, challenges, and tries to find practical guidance and patterns that are, adaptable, not rigid rules.
And that adaptability, that practicality, really comes from experience, doesn't it? You said these aren't just academics.
That's such a critical point they make, yeah. The authors, the examples they use, it's all deeply rooted in firsthand experience. One person served for decades in places like Quebec, Latin America, now works globally.
Wow.
The other spent years in Germany, Central Europe, teaching, consulting in, I think, over 40 countries. So a lot of the insights are coming straight from their own work or people they've interviewed who are, right there doing it.
Over 40 countries. Okay, that's some serious ground truth. And they challenge some pretty standard ideas about what a church even is, don't they?
They really do. They ask us to kind of rethink assumptions that are often heavily influenced by, say, Western culture.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, things like needing a full-time paid pastor, or owning a specific building, or holding services only on Sunday mornings, or even having formal legal status with, a constitution and bylaws.
Right. The stuff we often just assume.
Exactly. They argue these things might be helpful, maybe even desirable sometimes, but they aren't the biblical definition of a church.
Like the churches Paul planted. They probably didn't look like that.
Precisely. I mean, think about many of the congregations we read about in Acts or the letters, meeting in homes led by local believers, sometimes people who just converted, often facing persecution.
Yeah.
They wouldn't fit what some might consider a minimal standard today. Yet Paul clearly calls them the church. In Ephesus or Corinth or wherever, it really forces you to look deeper at the biblical essence of what a local church is.
So it's this thing that's deeply spiritual, totally dependent on God, but it's also a very human, practical project.
That's exactly how they frame it. It's profoundly spiritual, utterly dependent on God's guidance, on prayer. A true church ultimately is built by the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
But it's also a complex human undertaking. It needs wisdom, insight, careful preparation. They actually quote Proverbs 19.2, which is key here. It is not good to have zeal without knowledge, nor to be hasty and miss the way.
Zeal without knowledge.
Passion, vision, absolutely essential. But without that practical wisdom, that understanding of the context and the process, you can end up just incredibly frustrated, or worse, maybe even cause harm.
Okay, That groundwork really helps frame what we're talking about. So now let's get into the motivation. Why? Why is there this significant renewed focus on church planting globally? What are the compelling reasons the sources bring up?
Well, a major one, especially if you look within mission circles, is the concern for what they call unreached people.
Unreached peoples.
Yeah, these are groups, could be ethnic, linguistic, geographic, who just don't have a viable Christian witness among them. There's no church speaking their language, understanding their culture, making the gospel accessible. The sources note a big increase in focus on this in recent decades. It's led to strategies like adopt a people movements, things like that.
So number one is reaching those who haven't been reached yet. Makes sense.
Yes. And number two, it's also seen as vital for the long-term growth and health of existing churches and movements, even in places people call post-Christian, where traditional church membership might be declining.
Yeah.
These sources note that some established denominations are actually exploring planting new works as a way to reconnect with their communities, to find new life.
Interesting. Okay, so strategy, health. What about a more foundational, maybe biblical reason?
Oh, absolutely. The sources trace it right back to God's purposes through history. They talk about this continuity from ancient Israel being called God's special people to the church being the new people of God. Yeah. They point to passages like 1 Peter 2, which echoes Exodus 19. And this new community, the church, is called to be a light for the Gentiles, right? That theme from Acts 13. Yeah. And maybe most explicitly, Christ himself said he would build his church. That's Matthew 16:18. The sources argue that this building, well, it necessarily involves planting local assemblies. They connect it even to passages like Matthew 18 about local church life.
So it's tied right into Christ's mission, the identity of God's people. Yeah. And focusing back on the unreached for a sec, how big is that picture, really?
Yeah, it's massive. The sources site estimates, pointing to millions, maybe even billions globally who are part of populations where there just isn't an existing church that speaks their language or gets their culture well enough to make the gospel truly accessible. So without new churches planted specifically among them, it's just highly unlikely they'll ever hear or understand it.
And there's a practical point, too, about new believers.
Yeah, they mention the reality that new believers who aren't connected into a local church community pretty quickly, well, they have a very high rate of just falling away. The community aspect is crucial.
Okay. Now, what about planting where churches do already exist? Doesn't that sometimes, I don't know, feel like competition or stepping on toes?
That's a really sensitive point, yeah, and the sources tackle it directly. They absolutely acknowledge the risk of what people call sheep stealing.
Right.
And they're crystal clear. Planting new churches where the main motive is competition, or just raising your denomination's flag, or trying to attract members from other churches, that's just wrong. Full stop.
Okay. But what if the existing churches maybe aren't effectively reaching the whole community or specific groups within it?
That's where it gets more nuanced. The sources also push back against the idea that existing churches should just automatically oppose any new plant simply to protect their turf, or to maintain a tradition that maybe isn't really connecting anymore.
So how do you navigate that?
Their suggestion is crucial. Prioritize open communication. Demonstrate goodwill, respect. The purpose of the new plant needs to be really clear. It's about evangelizing and serving the unreached or underserved parts of the community in new ways, not siphoning off members.
Okay.
And actually sharing objective data, like demographic information showing the community's real spiritual needs, can be super helpful. It can show, look, there's more than enough harvest here for everyone.
That feels like a really important insight for anyone starting something new, church, or otherwise. Clear purpose, respectful communication, especially when you're entering an existing space. You mentioned other reasons, too.
Yeah, a couple more. One is that planting new churches can actually have a revitalizing effect on the established ones.
How so?
Well, seeing a new work, try creative methods, or reach different groups, or just move quickly can challenge the older church's assumptions, It can prove that, that won't work here, often isn't actually true. It might even spark joint efforts that benefit everybody.
Interesting dynamic. And the final reason?
Serving the ignored. The sources point out, realistically, that many existing churches, for whatever historical or cultural reasons, sometimes struggle to effectively welcome or serve the poor or maybe marginalized groups in their area.
Okay.
So planting new churches among those specific groups can sometimes be the most realistic and, frankly, the most effective way to actually reach them.
And they have an example of this.
They share a really dramatic one. The Gramin Pachin Mandal movement among the Bangi Dalits in India. Now, this wasn't about planting a traditional church for the Dalits from the outside. It was a movement among them.
Yep.
Started, I think, around 1984. By 2004, it had grown to over 700,000 baptized believers.
Whoa. 700,000 in 20 years.
Pretty.
That's astonishing growth.
Yeah.
Does the material explain why? What was the key there?
Right. It's incredible. And they really dig into this because it highlights such a major insight. The key wasn't just going to the poor or ignored. It was planting among them. It was empowering local Dalit leaders, people from inside that community, using their cultural forms, their ways of communicating, and crucially, giving dignity where society had constantly denied it. It shows that really deep contextualization and local ownership, they aren't just nice ideas. When you apply them effectively, especially among marginalized groups, they can fuel growth you wouldn't have thought possible. It completely challenges our sort of standard approaches.
That's a powerful case study. Wow.
Yeah.
It really underscores that importance of context, local leadership. It changes the whole dynamic.
Yeah.
So we've laid the groundwork. We've explored the why. Now let's shift gears a bit to the how. Let's draw some wisdom from biblical patterns, historical approaches, which the sources really emphasize.
Right. So they point us back to the very beginning, Gospels, Acts. And they highlight something interesting. The early church didn't get like a detailed step-by-step manual for church planting after Pentecost.
No instruction book.
Not really. They knew their mission. Jesus gave them that. They had the Holy Spirit leading them. And essentially, they learned by doing. Grounded, of course, in Jesus' teaching about the kingdom, like being salt and light from Matthew 5. Right. Acts, the sources argue, shows this really dynamic process. It's a series of responses to the Spirit's leading, to the local context. It's not a fixed formula that we're just supposed to replicate exactly everywhere.
But they still found patterns in Acts that are relevant for us.
Yes, exactly. That's the key distinction. While it's not a rigid blueprint, they talk about identifying consistent patterns in Acts that have representative value.
Representative value.
Meaning patterns that repeat across different situations, that align with the rest of Scripture, and aren't just unique to one specific time or place. Paul's ministry especially offers a lot of these patterns that we can adapt for today.
Okay, so how would you describe Paul's approach then? Was he working from some kind of master plan?
The sources describe it less as a fixed plan and more like a flexible modus operandi, or working style, guided by the Holy Spirit for sure. Yeah. He definitely had an overall direction. His mission was clear: spread the gospel from Jerusalem towards Rome, maybe even Spain. And he was strategic. He often targeted key urban centers, knowing they were hubs for influence, communication, travel.
Right, makes sense. And a core part of his method was developing local leaders.
Absolutely crucial. Yeah. One really noteworthy pattern was how he recruited coworkers right from the churches he planted. They call it recruiting from the harvest for the next harvest. And these coworkers, they were increasingly Gentile believers. It shows he was willing to empower new converts quickly. And then you see him giving clear guidance on appointing local leaders like elders and deacons. Think of Titus 1.5.
Right.
The sources really emphasize this dual concern Paul had. Yes, for the health and maturity of the existing churches, but also for identifying and developing new workers who could carry the mission forward. They point to 2 Timothy 2.2 there. Leadership development is presented as absolutely essential for multiplication.
Okay, and this brings us to a specific model they discuss, which sounds, well, challenging, but maybe really effective. The apostolic church planter.
Yes, this is a distinct approach, really based on that Pauline pattern.
Yeah.
Think of it less like a traditional pastor who settles down long-term in one spot, and more like a missionary catalyst. The apostolic planter is often itinerant. They move around, and their main focus is on empowering local believers, usually lay believers, to lead and reproduce the work themselves.
So they don't stick around to be the pastor.
Right. The goal isn't to build the work around their own long-term presence. It's to equip others quickly and effectively, establish the church, and then often move on to the next place, leaving it in local hands.
So the aim is self-governing, self-supporting, self-reproducing churches.
That's the ideal, yes. Led by people from within that community. Historically, figures like Henry Venn, Roland Allen, they strongly advocated this, and the sources had this really compelling case study.
Where a mission shifted its strategy to this model, focusing on empowering local workers. And they saw basically double the results in 1 year compared to the previous 10 years under the old approach.
Double the results in a year. just by shifting focus to empowering locals.
Hmm.
Wow, that really drives home that multiplication point. What makes that model work so well, and what are the challenges?
Well, its effectiveness comes from tapping into local resources, local understanding, local energy. It inherently promotes lay ownership,
Yeah.
and it avoids creating dependency on outside professionals or funding.
Right.
But yeah, the sources say it can be difficult. It might be challenging in cultures where leadership is really strongly tied to formal credentials. Potential lay leaders might just lack time because of work.
Sure.
And the planter themselves needs exceptional gifts in equipping others fast. Plus, the churches will likely still need ongoing support, maybe itinerant teaching, even after the main planter leaves. It sounds incredibly powerful, but yeah, it requires a very specific skill set, and it's definitely context dependent.
Okay, the sources use this really nice image saying the church has a living shape. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, it refers to the church being an organism, right? Not just an institution.
Yeah.
And like any organism, it can adapt, it transforms. The shape is the specific pattern, the form it takes for gathering, for operating.
Okay.
And critically, this shape must be contextualized. It has to be adapted to the local culture, the environment. They really emphasize that understanding the local cultural roadmap is essential. It helps you figure out, what forms from elsewhere might work, what needs tweaking, and what maybe just needs to be rejected entirely for this place.
Okay, so the shape is flexible. What are some of the common shapes or models they describe based on this?
They discuss several common ones found in the sources. One is the voluntary gathered congregation. They note this one is pretty heavily influenced by Western, especially U.S. culture, typically smaller, views the church mainly as a voluntary assembly.
Another is the cell church model. This one tries to balance small group gatherings, the cells, where you get deeper community, discipleship, maybe accountability, with larger, more celebratory gatherings. The cell is often seen as the core community unit in that model.
And they give examples of this contextualization, this shaping in practice.
Yeah, it's about using forms that feel natural and meaningful locally. So it could be meeting in homes if that's where people normally gather socially, or maybe adapting local cultural festivals to tell biblical stories or celebrate Christian themes.
It makes sense.
They share this fascinating example of working with a nomad society. There, they focused first on transformed families as the basic unit. And they actually delayed using a formal church label until enough families were involved to sort of replicate the society's normal social functions within the Christian community itself.
Wow, that's letting the local context truly shape the form, isn't it? Do they talk about different types of church plants too, like based on who's planting or the immediate situation?
Yeah, they touch on a few. There's the individual pioneer, often really tough, high failure rate, unless the person is exceptional or the place is unusually open.
Okay.
There's non-resident or short-term planting involved maybe repeated short visits or just a few months on site. And then international or expatriate churches often start by serving expats, but sometimes end up attracting locals or other immigrant groups too.
Right.
And they also point out, interestingly, that sometimes a church can just emerge sort of incidentally from other ministries, like maybe development work or campus ministry, that wasn't initially planned as a church plant.
And how do these different shapes and types reproduce? What are the strategies they mention for multiplication?
They detail several methods. You've got mother-daughter churches where an established church sends out members, often with significant support, to start a new one. The Central Munich example they give is one of those. Multi-site churches, they have a central leadership, maybe central teaching via video, but meet in multiple physical locations. There's also the adopted daughter model, where maybe an independent fellowship gets help from a larger church or denomination to become more formalized.
Got it. Any others?
Yeah, they mentioned the focus people or multi-congregation approach. This is where an existing church starts a distinct congregation within its structure, specifically for a different ethnic, linguistic, or maybe social group. Sometimes they even meet in the same building, just different times or with different leaders.
Okay. Which models do the sources suggest have the most potential for rapid multiplication?
House church reproduction gets highlighted for that, especially in relational societies.
Why is that?
Well, because house churches are typically smaller, they're usually led by lay people, and they require minimal structure or overhead, meeting in homes. So they can reproduce much more quickly than models needing paid staff, buildings, complex organization. They describe this pattern where one house church grows, forms two nuclei, and then splits into two autonomous house churches.
Interesting. And they even acknowledge less ideal origins.
Yeah, realistically, they do. They acknowledge that sometimes church splits, which are usually painful and not a great testimony, have actually resulted in new churches being formed. They even reference the conflict between Paul and Barnabas in Acts
Oh, right.
as an example of how even a sharp disagreement led to two mission teams going out instead of just one. So sometimes growth happens in unexpected ways.
Okay. Are there specific strategic approaches for planting in areas where there are very few or maybe no churches at all?
Definitely. They outline several. Harvest priority planting focuses energy where people seem most receptive to the gospel. Strategic beachhead planting aims to get at least one church established in every significant unevangelized town or city in a region.
Okay.
Cluster planting concentrates several plants in a limited geographical area. The idea is mutual support, cumulative impact. They mention examples in Lima, Peru, and also a lay-led movement in Vienna. And then spreading vine planting involves planting churches sequentially along, say, transportation routes or maybe through chains of relationships.
It really sounds like understanding the context, the people, the geography, the culture is absolutely essential for picking the right shape and strategy. It's definitely not one size fits all. Okay, moving from the shapes to the actual work on the ground. Let's look at the process: strategy, research, launching, growth. The sources break this down into phases, right?
Yeah, they talk about typical developmental phases, things like launch, then establishing, structuring, reproducing, and eventually release, where the plant is fully autonomous.
Okay.
And a crucial point they make is that you need different gifts and skills at each phase. A lot of church plants apparently stall because they rely too heavily on just the planter's initial gifts.
Ah, so the founding visionary might not be the best person to structure things later.
Exactly, which is why building a diverse team with complementary skills right from the beginning or early on is presented as absolutely critical.
Got it. So what's involved in that initial preparation phase? Research sounds like a huge part of it.
Oh, massively emphasized, yeah. Research means really deeply studying the language, the culture, the demographics, social dynamics, the religious context of the community you're hoping to reach.
And why is that so important? Why not just jump in?
Well, the sources basically say doing this homework is essential to avoid being foolish or counterproductive. You need to understand the specific nuances, even of groups that might look similar from the outside. Cultural distance, even small distances, really matters in communication. It prevents major misunderstandings.
What kind of research are we talking about? Is it just like crunching numbers from a census?
It's both. They talk about quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative is the numbers, demographics, stats, surveys. It tells you what the community looks like from a distance, how many people, ages, languages, etc.
Okay.
Qualitative is more like, well, ethnographic studies, spending time observing, listening, interviewing people to understand the meanings behind things, the reasons people do what they do. It tells you why things are the way they are. Both are really valuable pieces of the puzzle.
Qualitative sounds harder. Maybe takes longer.
It can, yeah. But they even provide this helpful list, like 20 questions, to guide that kind of study. Questions aimed at getting at core values, beliefs about the supernatural, people's fears, hopes, how they understand cause and effect. And they highlight how sometimes exploring an answer that seems really baffling at first can lead to profound insights into the culture's whole worldview. It's not necessarily quick, but you can definitely have early breakthroughs in understanding.
Okay, so that deep preparation then leads into the actual launch.
Yes, the launch phase builds right on that prep. And a foundational principle here is building personal relationships first.
Before trying to do anything.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially in many cultures where relationships are just key. They come before tasks. Taking time to socialize, share meals, just chat. It isn't a distraction. It's fundamental. It shows genuine love, respect, builds trust. You need that trust for any long-term work.
Makes sense. And then the evangelism part during the launch. How do they approach that?
Well, they list various approaches. Personal sharing, visiting homes, servant evangelism, meeting practical needs as a way of showing the gospel. Larger events, too.
Okay.
But a really critical insight they share is presenting evangelism as a process, not just a single decision point.
Right.
Focusing only on getting a quick yes, a quick decision, can sometimes lead to really superficial conversions. People might say yes without fully understanding, or they might root it in misunderstanding the core message.
You mean like someone's saying yes, but interpreting Jesus through their old beliefs, adding him to a list of gods or something.
Exactly. They use the example of a man named Papaya in India. When he first heard about Jesus, his immediate thought was, Is this just another avatar, another deity to add to my collection?
Ah, okay.
That story really illustrates the danger of what they call Christo-paganism, where the new beliefs get filtered and distorted by the old, unaddressed worldview.
Mm.
So effective evangelism needs to engage with those fundamental worldview issues, who God is, what sin is, redemption, the spiritual realm, to build a solid foundation.
So tools like, say, the 4 spiritual laws might need adjusting.
They might. Concepts like abundant life or new birth, even sin, can mean very different things across cultures or be easily misunderstood. They need careful explanation and maybe adaptation.
And they highlighted the power of different communication methods too, right? Like storytelling.
Oh, powerfully, yeah. They share this example of Pastor Dinanath in India. He initially used a very standard lecture-style teaching method, and it just wasn't connecting.
Okay.
But then he shifted. He started using oral methods, telling Bible stories, using traditional music in his own language forms that were natural and valued in that culture. And everything changed.
How so?
In 6 years, he went from one small church to 75 churches with like 1,350 baptized believers.
Wow. Same message, different method, totally different result.
Exactly. People understood because it was presented in a way that resonated deeply with how they learned and communicated.
Incredible. What about follow-up then, for new believers?
They acknowledge it's challenging, but absolutely vital. Personal, face-to-face follow-up is highlighted as way more effective, producing more lasting fruit than just impersonal methods. They suggest small group Bible studies in comfortable, accessible places as a good approach, especially in cities where one-on-one can be tough logistically.
And they talk about integrating service with evangelism, being holistic.
Yes, very much so. Especially among the poor or in urban settings, evangelism is presented as basically inseparable from addressing people's real-life social, economic, physical needs.
Okay.
They describe the relationship as distinct but integral. They use that powerful image of a marriage, referencing the Lausanne Covenant.
And the Caracas church example fits here.
Perfectly. Las Acacias Church. It actually started with a service ministry phone counseling, and it grew to integrate medical clinics, legal aid, drug rehab, all alongside clear evangelistic witness and discipleship. It's about living out the gospel in light of the whole person, spiritual and physical. They also note an interesting difference. In urban planting, ministry often seems to drive or come before the Sunday gathering, whereas in suburban planting, the Sunday service tends to be the driver for other ministry activities. Interesting observation.
Huh. What about baptism? What does that fit in?
Following the New Testament pattern, the sources generally advocate for prompt baptism after someone shows credible conversion and confesses faith.
So not waiting months and months.
Generally not, but they also caution against baptizing too quickly if the understanding is shallow or the motives aren't clear. They suggest looking for clear evidence of commitment, change, and maybe even getting input from other new believers who know the person.
And discipleship sounds like it needs to go really deep, addressing more than just head knowledge.
Absolutely. New believers don't arrive as blank slates, right? They come with complex histories, old habits, maybe unresolved conflicts, unhealthy relationships, plus distortions from their old worldview, maybe fear of spirits or certain traditional practices.
Right.
So discipleship has to be both corrective, addressing those deep-rooted issues, maybe even spiritual bondage and developmental, really fostering a transformed worldview over time. It involves biblical teaching, leaders modeling the life, prayer, relying on Christ. It's often a long process. Having team members skilled in things like counseling or apologetics can be really helpful here.
It's clear that launching growth process is incredibly multifaceted. It really requires deep understanding, patience, adaptability.
Okay, shifting gears again slightly. Let's look at the people doing this work and the support systems they need. The sources get into the planter's life, teams, training, partnerships.
Right. The section on the planter's life is quite realistic. It acknowledges the very real personal challenges involved.
Like burnout. Burnout, stress, yeah. It emphasizes the need for ongoing personal growth, finding balance, especially between home and ministry, which gets tricky when your ministry is in your home, and having strong support systems. Things like mentors, coaches, learning communities where you connect with other planters facing similar things. They even note the stress levels for planters in crisis situations can be similar to other high-demand helping professions.
Wow, okay. And the sources really seem to emphasize the power of teams.
Oh, absolutely. Planting with a team offers huge advantages. You get complementary gifts, right? So
Yeah.
you're stronger together than alone. There's mutual support for getting through the tough times, accountability to keep each other on track.
Yeah.
And frankly, a team can just tackle bigger, more complex projects than one person usually can. They list benefits like greater boldness, more creativity, higher productivity, increased security, protection from temptation, reducing that sense of isolation.
But working that closely together, conflict seems almost inevitable, doesn't it?
Yeah, the sources are very realistic about that. Conflict is part of the picture. Could be different philosophies of ministry, personality clashes, competition over resources, feeling like things aren't fair.
Right.
They wisely point out that conflict becomes really destructive when the team members are just unprepared or they lack the skills to manage it well. Often, a lack of trust is the root issue. That leads to breakdowns in commitment, accountability, and ultimately you get poor results.
So good team leadership is critical.
Crucial. Leaders who understand the culture, who choose members with complementary strengths and proven loyalty, and who genuinely believe the team is stronger than just themselves.
Okay. Moving to how you equip people for this, especially for multiplication.
Okay.
The sources argue it's not just about formal training for the professionals.
That's a really key point they make, yeah. They argue that as long as church planting is seen as something only highly trained, maybe fully paid professionals can do, multiplication is going to be slow.
So the key is empowering lay people.
Exactly. Empowering and equipping laypersons, just everyday believers, is presented as essential if you want rapid reproduction.
So what methods do they suggest for equipping people beyond maybe traditional Bible schools?
They describe several approaches that work well for empowering lay leaders. There's informal daily life discipleship and mentoring, just doing life together, workshops focused on specific skills they need, equipping that happens within the ministry teams themselves, like on-the-job coaching, and individual instruction, too.
Any specific models mentioned?
Yeah, they mentioned Garrison's MAWL model stands for Model Assist, Watch, Leave. It's used a lot in grassroots movements. The experienced leader models a task, then assists the trainee as they try it, then watches them do it successfully, and then leaves them to do it while the leader moves on to train others.
Model, assist, watch, leave.
Okay. They also highlight things like church-based residencies or internships as really practical, hands-on training offered by churches that are committed to multiplication themselves.
Partnerships also sound like a really big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, working together, huge benefits. Synergy, doing more together than apart. Better stewardship of resources, mutual protection, increased strength.
Got an example?
They share a compelling one from Central Asia. An American church planter struggled for 7 years with no converts. Then he partnered with a Korean missionary who had a much deeper understanding of the local traditional culture.
Ah.
By combining that cultural insight with the team's resources, they were able to unlock new opportunities and actually start churches. It shows how different perspectives and partnership can be key.
What kind of partnerships are common?
Congregation-to-congregation partnerships are pretty frequent. A church in one place partners directly with a team or a church plant somewhere else. These often involve short-term mission teams, STM trips.
Right, those are popular. What's the take on them?
Well, the sources acknowledge STM trips can be valuable, educating people back home, motivating them. But they also give a strong caution. They can easily become just religious tourism if they aren't planned really carefully and coordinated with the local church or team on the ground.
Meaning they need to actually serve local needs.
Exactly. Making sure they're truly helpful and not just a feel-good trip that might actually burden the hosts. Good coordination is key.
Finally, practical resources. Support, obviously necessary.
Yeah, and unfortunately, lack of funds is listed as a common reason church plants fail. The sources discuss finding creative ways to support workers, especially in grassroots movements.
Like how?
And they mention this Colombian example where planters live really simply on minimal mixed support, maybe like 300, 400 US a month, cobbled together from family, local churches, joint funds, maybe some part-time work. It requires real sacrificial living, but it allows the work to happen locally without massive outside funding.
And what about leveraging funds? What do they mean by that?
This is really key for outside support. Instead of just paying ongoing salaries or putting up buildings, leveraging funds means investing in things that multiply the impact.
Like what?
Like leadership development, training, sponsoring training centers for national planters, providing bivocational training, equipping people with the trade and ministry skills so they can support themselves, funding theological education by extension, producing discipleship materials in local languages. supporting Bible translation.
Ah, I see. Investing in things that build local capacity.
Exactly. These are ways outside funds can have a much greater, more sustainable impact by equipping locals and building capacity, rather than creating the dependency that can happen if you're just funding salaries or buildings long term.
It's clear that supporting the people and the teams is just as complex and vital as the planting process itself. Needs creativity, strategic thinking about resources. The sources also talk about the broader impact, describing new churches as kingdom communities. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, that concept means these new communities aren't just supposed to be focused internally on themselves. They're meant to demonstrate Christ's lordship, his influence in all areas of life: personal, family, social, economic, maybe even political spheres.
Okay, how do they break that down?
They talk about three interconnected dimensions. There's the Great Commission, the call to evangelize, make disciples. There's the Great Commandment, loving God and neighbor, which shows up in practical service. And then the Great Calling, living out our faith in the world, dealing with issues of stewardship, justice, engaging the culture.
So it's definitely about more than just getting people into a meeting on Sunday.
Oh, much, much more. Especially when working among the poor or in urban areas, the sources really strongly emphasize this idea of holistic mission.
Holistic mission.
Yeah, they argue that genuine evangelism just cannot be separated from addressing people's real social, economic, physical needs. They describe the relationship again as distinct but integral. That marriage idea from the Lausanne Covenant comes up again.
Now, the Caracas Church, Las Acacias, is the example again.
It's a prime example, yeah. A church that intentionally integrates all these service ministries, medical, legal, rehab, right alongside clear gospel witness and discipleship.
What principles do they suggest for doing that kind of service ministry effectively?
Some key principles come through. Focusing on community development, based on local needs and local assets, not just imposing outside ideas. Having a long-term vision. Prioritizing empowerment over just giving aid, helping people become self-reliant, not creating dependency.
Right. Participation sounds key too.
Absolutely. Ensuring local participation right from the start in planning and doing the work. And maintaining that holistic approach, addressing both spiritual and physical needs together. They also note that the gospel message itself is actually a powerful force for empowerment because it elevates human dignity and fosters responsibility.
How does service fit into the actual church planting process itself? Does service lead to planting?
It can connect in different ways. Sometimes service might be incidental, just occasional projects the church does. Sometimes it's catalytic, where service activities are intentionally used to open doors, build relationships, and that leads to a church plant. Or it can even be generative, where a service ministry grows and develops so much that it eventually kind of gives birth to a church community from within itself. Yeah. They also wisely warn about potential pitfalls, though. Service, if not done carefully, could accidentally promote materialistic values or create an attitude of entitlement if it's just handout-based and doesn't focus on participation and empowerment.
Yeah.
Needs wisdom.
Right. And the sources wrap up this section with an example of an indigenous leader putting this all into practice.
Yes, the story of Elias in Liberia. Here's an indigenous African leader responding to the challenge to reach millions of his own people and neighboring groups. He forms an indigenous African mission. He intentionally trains bivocational workers, tent makers, specifically for Muslim areas where traditional mission models often struggled.
Wow.
And he launches multiplication training focused on empowering lay leaders. It's just a powerful example of how these principles, indigenous leadership, contextualize methods like tent making, focusing on the unreached, emphasizing multiplication training, are being applied effectively by local leaders around the world to create that kind of broad kingdom impact.
That's a fantastic note to end this section on. Really shows it's a truly global movement with local leadership right at the heart.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, we've seen that church planting, according to these sources, it's this really dynamic, complex, but also deeply rewarding thing. It's definitely not about following some rigid formula.
No, it requires this unique blend, doesn't it? Deep spiritual reliance on God, but combined with practical wisdom, cultural intelligence, working well in teams, and this fundamental commitment to multiplying disciples and leaders, not just, building institutions. It's an adaptable mission.
And whether or not you, the listener, are directly involved in starting a church, it feels like so many of the principles we've unpacked today are just universally valuable.
I think so, too. If you're starting any new initiative, maybe leading a team, navigating change in your community, or even your workplace, or just trying to understand how movements grow,
Yeah.
those lessons about adapting to your context, empowering others, staying focused on your core purpose, blending that big picture vision with practical, wise steps, they're incredibly relevant, aren't they?
Absolutely. And the material leaves us with this one final, really provocative thought that stood out to me.
Ah, what was that?
The sources highlight that these rapidly growing church planting movements, they often don't emerge during times of peace and quiet and stability.
Right. They frequently arise during sounds of significant change, upheaval, even persecution.
That really challenges our natural human preference for comfort, for predictability, doesn't
It
it?
absolutely does, yeah.
It just makes you wonder, if that's true on a global scale, what might it mean for us to look for opportunities for planting new things, new initiatives, new ways of doing things, or maybe fostering multiplication and growth? Not despite the unexpected upheavals and changes happening around you right now, but maybe even because of them. Something to think about.